Hi, Matt Rail here again from Serrano Creek Soil Movements. In this video, we're going to examine whether it's time to water or not to water. And sometimes our plants give us clues that we misinterpret, and what we typically do is that we overwater rather than underwater. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with just a tiny bit of science, and then we're going to learn some tools and techniques that we could use to help us determine that, and then we'll go out in the field and we'll do a few tests on some different locations with different watering problems. Now, we all know that we need to add water for plants, but we also need to understand that we need to also allow oxygen to get into the soil. It's very important because the organisms that feed our plants, they require oxygen, and surprisingly, parts of the plant, such as the roots, don't make oxygen like the leaves. In fact, they themselves require oxygen to metabolize the sugars that the plant provides. And they absorb that oxygen from the soil. So when we water plants, we're giving them the nourishment of the water, but if we give them way too much water, then we're depriving them of the oxygen. We're basically drowning the plants. When we overwater, we get a condition called saturated soil, and this is the point where there's just absolutely no room for oxygen in the soil whatsoever. It's 100% water and the soil. There's just no space. Then on the other end, if we never water our plants, well, there's lots of room for oxygen to get in, but there's no available water for the plants to absorb. In between these two spots, which is saturated soil, which is too much water, what's called the wilting point, which is not enough water, is this center area, and that's called field capacity. And if we're doing our job correctly, we want to always keep our moisture levels within field capacity, which means there's a lot of water, but still room for oxygen to get in on one end. And then as the plant draws down the water, oxygen level goes up, but there's always still enough water. We don't ever want to get the point where we go into what's the wilting point zone, which will, our plant will wilt because it'll just not be getting enough water. Now, sometimes what happens is when we overwater or we underwater, in both cases, plants will wilt, they'll get yellow leaves, and sometimes even drop those leaves. Now, many of us have been conditioned, when we see plants exhibiting these conditions, we need to apply water. And boy, that's great if there's not enough water in the soil, but if you've already watered the soil too much, adding just that much more water is only going to make things worse. It becomes kind of a vicious cycle. The plant wilts more, we add more water, there's more yellow leaves, and we keep adding water. Just like you can't judge a book by its cover, you really can't judge the moisture level of soil by what's going on in the surface. The surface can appear to be very dry and almost dusty, but down where the roots are, there could be more than enough moisture. And if we make our watering decisions based on what the surface looks like, very often we will overwater. So here's a few tests that we can do to see what's really going on. The first is if you dig a hole by your plant, a small hole, it can be with a shovel or a hand trowel, you want to get down to where the root zone is and just look at the soil and see what it looks like. If when you dig that hole and after a few minutes water starts to leach in, boy, that's a sign that you have way too much water and you definitely need to cut back for probably quite a while. The second thing you do with that soil that you dug out of that hole is to smell it. Does it smell sweet like a forest that has just rained? Or does it stink and it's sour or maybe a bitter smell? If it's the latter, what that's telling you is that you have, again, too much water, you've lost the oxygen in that soil, and the organisms that now have colonized that soil are the anaerobic ones, the ones that make toxic oils and acids and such forth that are going to really harm your plants. Your third test is, again with that same soil, grab a handful of it and squeeze it really hard. If any moisture drops out of that soil, just a drip or two, what that's telling you is, again, you have way too much water in that soil and you should not be watering anymore. The fourth test is when you squeeze that soil and it remains in a ball, that's also a good indication that you have plenty of water in that soil. Now, in some situations, like with very sandy soil, it just won't stay in a ball, and no matter how much water you've added to the soil, it won't form a ball. So you have to kind of use a little estimate about what the soil is, and I think we've all been to the beach and we know what really sandy soil is. If you're unable to form a ball and it's not sandy soil, it's dry and crumbly, and no matter how hard you squeeze, it does not form a ball, then yes, now it's time to water. Now, if you don't want to dig a bunch of holes and you're afraid it might damage your plants, we have some other techniques that work pretty well. One of my favorites is just to push in a paint stir stick. Stick it in for 10 or 20 minutes, pull it out, and what you'll find is if there's a dark mark on the stick where it was in the soil, that's a good indication that there's plenty of moisture in the soil. If you have trouble even pushing that stick in, that's a good sign that the soil is not wet enough because the moisture acts as a lubricant and allows the soil to give way. Dry soil, it's very hard to push items into. Another technique I like to use is a piece of rebar. You can get it for a couple bucks at the hardware store. Push this in. If you're able to push this in easily, that's a good sign that the soil has enough moisture. If when you pull it out, it makes kind of a vacuum and it's hard to get it out, all that moisture in the soil is creating that vacuum, plenty of moisture. And what I like about this is along the serrations of the rebar, it kind of gives you a little core sample of what the soil looks like depending on how far you've pushed it in. If you like that idea of the rebar, a more scientific version is the soil quarter or soil tester. And basically what you do is you push it into the soil. Again, if it goes in easily, it's a good sign the soil has enough moisture. Then as you pull it out, it gives you a good sampling of what your moisture levels are in that soil. So very often we look at plants like these wilted kale plants and we think, oh, these plants need water. And it's very natural for us to grab the garden hose and water these plants because obviously they're wilting from not enough water. Just for information, it's probably about 75 degrees outside, average humidity, so there's no real reason for these kale to be wilting. It's a fairly stiff plant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to test that soil by some of our techniques. The first one I've done is I've put in a stake, and if I lift this stake out, if you look at all this coloration, when this stake is wet, that means there's more than enough water, maybe even too much water in this soil. See how dark it is right here? And so that's one sign we definitely don't want to add more water. The next technique I'm going to use is I'm going to use this piece of rebar. I've put tape on the end so I don't cut myself. These can be sharp. A couple bucks. What's nice about this is this serration is going to pick up samples of my soil. So I'm going to push that down in. Oh, it goes very easily. What it's telling me is that with all that moisture in the soil, it acts as a lubricant, and that goes down very easily. So we have more than enough water in this soil. So I'm going to lift this out. And as I do, there's kind of a sucking sound, meaning that there's probably too much water in this soil, and that's why these guys are wilting. Clearly, we do not need to add any more moisture to this. We could use our core sample. I'm going to push this in like this. And take a turn and left out. Same thing, there's a lot of suction, which means that water is forming a vacuum, making it hard to pull this out. So we have clearly plenty of moisture in this soil. It's actually very damp to the hand. And then probably the best way is just to actually dig a hole. So I'm going to dig a hole here and kind of actually see what's going on down there. And I'm going to take some of this soil, and it has a little bit of sand in it, so it's not going to become super dense, but I definitely can squeeze this into a ball. That tells me there's plenty of moisture in there. See, it leaves watermarks on my hand, so this, again, probably a little too much water is causing this wilting. Definitely is not wilting from lack of moisture. This I can promise you. And I can squeeze this, and it definitely holds a ball. It's like this, and then, so because it holds together like this is definitely no need to water. So this soil has, I think, too much moisture. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to water these plants. My surface is going to look dry. I'm going to think I need to water, but before I water, I'm going to do this test. And I think what we'll find is these kale will come back around. They won't wilt so much because they'll be getting that oxygen into the soil and breathing a lot better. They just have way too much water in this soil. So I've moved from our raised bed that was overwatered. With a little bit of searching, I have finally found an area that is, I believe, underwatered. It's been about 3 months. There's no irrigation in this location. It's been mowed, so it looks very dry. But let's use some of our equipment and see how dry it really is. So we're first going to try to see if we could push our paint stirrer in. And it goes pretty deep. And we're going to let that sit while we do our other tests, and we'll pull it out as a final confirmation. So our next test is our rebar test. And let's see, let's try it right here. That's it. So we got just probably about 4 or 5 inches, and then we hit hard dirt. And there's a good chance that hard dirt is going to be dry. Without the moisture, the dirt will not move and make room for the rebar. Again, we're going to confirm that using our soil core as well as our little trowel. So let's try to push this guy in and see what happens. Ugh. There, it broke through a layer. That's it. That's as deep as we can go. All my weight was on this trying to get this down. So we're going to pull this up, and what we're going to see is, in fact, that material needs water. We're going to try to make a ball out of this material, and even though there's a lot of clay in here, it just won't ball up. And I'm using all my strength, and if I go like this, you can see it just crumbles. So if we were going to irrigate this, it would be definitely time to irrigate. And if we pull this guy out, we could see that it's just dry on the surface. Our last test is actually see if we can dig a hole and see what's down inside here. It's a little more moisture, and it's actually probably enough to support more mature plant life, because we still can make a ball. A lot of clay in this material, and that's what's helping. If this had any sand in it. So now it's been several months since it's rained, and yet there's still enough moisture in here to sustain these oak trees. And if you use our paint stirrer stick, there's nothing. So I hope that gives you some good ideas about when to water. Very often, again, people overwater rather than underwater. Hopefully you've seen in some of the examples we did out in the field, kind of gave you an idea of maybe I should think twice before watering. Again, do these simple tests. If you do them, your plants will be happier, and there's a good chance you can save a lot of water and save on your budget. So again, thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to seeing you on our next video. Okay, bye-bye.